The crack of gunfire in the distance startled Constance O'Hara from her restless sleep, her eyes flying open to the darkness of her bedroom, heart pounding before she realized it was just thunder. Spring storms in Wyoming Territory were as fierce as they were unpredictable, much like the life she now faced alone. 6 months since Benjamin had been lowered into the cold ground behind the little white church in Independence, and still she reached for him each morning, her fingers finding nothing but empty sheets and cruel reality. The year was 1882, and the Rocking O Ranch was dying alongside her hopes and dreams. Constance slid from bed as the first fingers of dawn crept across the horizon, her bare feet cold against the rough wooden floor. At 32, she'd never imagined she'd be a widow, left alone to run a cattle ranch on the verge of collapse. Benjamin had been everything: husband, partner, friend, until a spooked horse had thrown him during a cattle drive, his neck snapping before he hit the ground. Now all that remained were mounting debts, dwindling cattle, and the pitying glances of townsfolk who gave her 6 more months before she lost everything. She dressed quickly in a simple brown skirt and white blouse, pinning her chestnut hair into a sensible bun. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized anymore, thinner, with shadows beneath her green eyes that spoke of endless worry and grief. "Not today," she whispered to her reflection, straightening her shoulders. "Today we fight." Downstairs, she stoked the kitchen fire and set coffee to boil. The house was too quiet without Benjamin's booming laugh or his boots stomping across the porch. Their daughter Emma, now 19 and recently married to the son of a banker in Cheyenne, had begged her mother to sell the ranch and come live with them. But Constance couldn't bear to part with the last piece of Benjamin she had left. This land had been their dream, purchased with every penny they'd saved over 15 years of marriage. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. The sun had barely risen. Who could be calling at this hour? Constance wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Hank Miller, her foreman and the last remaining ranch hand she could afford to keep on. "Mornin', Mrs. O'Hara," Hank said, hat in his weathered hands. His eyes wouldn't meet hers. "I hate to be the one to tell you this, but we got trouble. 30 head missing from the north pasture." Constance's stomach dropped. "Rustlers? Looks that way. Found cut fence and tracks heading east toward the mountains." She closed her eyes briefly. 30 cattle was a devastating blow, nearly a quarter of what remained of her herd. "I rode into town last night, tried to get Sheriff Taylor to form a posse," Hank continued, "but he said with the spring storms coming, tracking would be near impossible." Of course he did, Constance thought bitterly. Since Benjamin's death, the townsfolk had written her off as a lost cause. No one wanted to waste resources helping a widow they assumed would fail regardless. "We'll track them ourselves," she said with more conviction than she felt. Hank shifted uncomfortably. "That's the other thing I need to tell you, madam. I'm sorry, but I can't stay on. Got an offer from the Diamond Bar spread. They're paying twice what I make here." His eyes finally met hers, filled with genuine regret. "With a wife and 3 little ones, I just can't turn it down." Constance felt the news like a physical blow but forced herself to nod. "I understand, Hank. Your family needs to eat." She swallowed hard. "When do you leave?" "End of the week, if that's all right." "I didn't want to leave you with no warning." "You're a good man," she said, though her mind was already racing ahead to the impossible task of running the ranch entirely alone. "I wish you well." After Hank left, Constance sat at the kitchen table, her untouched coffee growing cold. Without a foreman and with no money to hire help, the Rocking O was finished. She would have to sell the remaining cattle at rock-bottom prices, then the land itself. The thought made her physically ill. The day passed in a blur of chores: feeding chickens, mending a broken fence near the barn, harvesting what vegetables remained in her small kitchen garden. By late afternoon, dark clouds were building to the west, promising another drenching. Constance was leading her mare back to the stable when she saw a rider approaching from the main road. She squinted against the fading light. Not Hank. This man rode taller, his posture easy in the saddle despite the obvious weariness of his horse. A stranger, then. Visitors were rare at the Rocking O these days. As he drew closer, Constance could make out a lean, broad-shouldered figure on a dusty buckskin gelding. The stranger wore a battered brown hat pulled low, and his clothes, though trail-worn, marked him as no drifter. A rifle was secured to his saddle, and he rode with the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable in the wilderness. She waited by the corral, one hand on the gate, the other near the small revolver she kept in her apron pocket. Benjamin had insisted she learn to shoot years ago, and she'd never been more grateful for his foresight. The rider stopped a respectful distance away and removed his hat. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and clear. "Name's Kieran O'Brien. I'm looking for work." He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair in need of a trim and several days' worth of stubble shadowing a strong jawline. His eyes, startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin, assessed her and the ranch in one sweeping glance. "I'm afraid you've wasted your time, Mr. O'Brien," Constance replied. "I'm not hiring. Couldn't help but notice your north fence is down and you've got tracks of about 30 head heading east," he said, ignoring her dismissal. "Rustlers get bold when they think a place is vulnerable." Constance stiffened. "And how would you know about my north fence? Rode past it on my way in. I've been tracking those same rustlers for 2 days. They hit another spread before yours, the Lazy S, about 20 miles south." She studied him more carefully. "Are you with the law?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, madam, just a cowboy who doesn't cotton to thieves. I worked the Lazy S last season before heading to Colorado for the winter. Was on my way back when I heard about the rustling. So you're playing hero?" The words came out harsher than she intended. He shrugged. "I'm looking for honest work, and it seems to me you could use an extra hand. I'll help you recover your cattle, and in return, you provide room, board, and fair wages when you can afford them." Thunder rumbled closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Constance hesitated. Every instinct told her to send this stranger on his way, but desperation made her reckless. "I can offer room and board," she said finally. "Wages will depend on whether we recover those cattle." He nodded once and dismounted in a fluid motion. Up close, he was even taller than she'd first thought, topping 6 feet easily. "That's fair. We should move fast. Storm's going to wash away any tracks left. We'll leave at first light," she said, turning toward the barn. "You can stable your horse here and sleep in the bunkhouse. It's empty now, but there are clean blankets." "Much obliged, Mrs. O'Hara, Constance O'Hara, your husband around?" His eyes scanned the property. "Dead," she said flatly. 6 months now." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition of her situation, perhaps, but not pity, which she appreciated. "Sorry to hear that. The Rocking O is yours, then?" "It is," he nodded, seeming to absorb this information without judgment. "I'll get my horse settled and be ready to ride at dawn." Constance watched him lead the buckskin into the barn, noting the easy way he moved, the quiet competence in his hands as he unsaddled the horse. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. That night, as rain pounded the roof and wind howled around the eaves, Constance lay awake thinking of the stranger in her bunkhouse. Kieran O'Brien was either the answer to her unspoken prayers or another complication she couldn't afford. Either way, come morning, they would be riding into danger together. 2 strangers bound by circumstance and 30 missing cattle. She rose before dawn, dressed in her most practical riding clothes, split skirt, sturdy boots, and a warm jacket. Her hair she braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Benjamin's revolver she secured at her waist. In the kitchen, she quickly prepared coffee and a simple breakfast of biscuits and salt pork. Kieran appeared in the doorway just as she was pouring the coffee, his presence filling the small kitchen. He'd shaved, she noticed, though his hair still curled slightly over his collar. "Morning," he said, removing his hat. "Smells good. Help yourself," she gestured to the stove. "We've got a long ride ahead." They ate quickly, speaking little. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear sky and mud-soaked ground. Kieran saddled their horses while Constance packed provisions, jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a small medical kit. Her mare, Penny, snorted nervously as Constance mounted, sensing the unusual tension in her rider. "The rustlers will be slowed by the mud and the cattle," Kieran said as they rode away from the ranch. "That gives us an advantage, even with the rain washing away tracks." "Do you think they're local?" Constance asked. He considered this. "Could be. Or drifters who know the territory well enough to find isolated ranches and escape routes. Either way, they're organized, the way they hit the lazy S and then your place suggests planning." They rode east toward the foothills, where the land grew rougher and dotted with pine and aspen groves. Kieran proved to be an exceptional tracker, finding signs invisible to Constance's untrained eye: a broken twig here, a tuft of cattle hair caught on a bush there, the faintest impression of hooves in a patch of sheltered ground. By midday, they had climbed into rockier terrain, and Kieran held up a hand to halt their progress. "They're trying to confuse anyone following," he said, dismounting to examine the ground more closely. "They've split up." Most of the cattle went north with a couple of men, but 2 riders continued east with just a few head, probably as a diversion. "Which group do we follow?" "North," he said without hesitation. "That's where your cattle are. They'll be heading for the old logging trails that run along the territorial border. Once they cross into Dakota territory, they're as good as gone." They pushed harder through the afternoon, stopping only to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and water from a clear stream. Constance found herself studying Kieran when he wasn't looking, the confident way he read the trail, the gentle hands that tended his horse, the quiet strength in his movements. "Where did you learn to track like this?" she asked as they rode side by side along a narrow ridge. "My father was a scout for the army back in the 50s. Taught me everything I know about tracking and surviving in wild country." He glanced at her. "What about you? You ride well for a," he caught himself. "For a woman," she finished, a small smile playing at her lips. "I was going to say rancher's wife, but I suspect you're more than that. I grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky, came west with my family when I was 16, met Benjamin 2 years later when he was working cattle for my father." The memories came easier than she expected. "We married when I was 20 and saved for 7 years to buy the Rocking O. It was nothing but a broken-down cabin and overgrazed pasture when we started. We built it together, every fence post and corral plank." "That's something to be proud of," he said quietly. "It was," she agreed, a lump forming in her throat. "Until now." He turned in his saddle to look at her directly. "You're still fighting for it, that counts for something." Before she could respond, he raised his hand sharply, signaling for silence. Ahead, through a stand of pines, came the low sound of cattle lowing. Kieran dismounted and motioned for Constance to do the same. They secured their horses and moved forward on foot, keeping low and quiet. Through the trees, they could see a small clearing where the rustlers had stopped to rest the cattle. 2 men sat by a small fire, while a third stood guard near the nervous herd. Constance's heart leapt when she recognized the Rocking O'Brien on the nearest steer. 3 of them, Kieran whispered, armed but not particularly alert. "What's our plan?" Constance asked, her hand moving instinctively to her revolver. "We wait until dark. They'll bed down the cattle for the night. Once they've settled, we'll make our move." His eyes met hers. "This could get dangerous. You should stay with the horses." Constance bristled. "These are my cattle, Mr. O'Brien. I'm coming with you." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close and follow my lead." They retreated to their horses and found a sheltered spot to wait for nightfall. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the temperature dropped sharply. Constance wrapped her jacket tighter around herself, trying not to shiver. "Here," Kieran said, offering her a worn but clean blanket from his saddlebag. "Can't have you catching your death." "Thank you." She accepted the blanket, surprised by the gesture. "How long have you been running the ranch alone?" he asked after a comfortable silence. "Since Benjamin died." "We had 3 hired hands then, but I've had to let them go one by one as money got tight. Hank, my foreman, is leaving at the week's end." She stared into the gathering darkness. "These cattle are the last chance I have of saving the Rocking O. Why not sell, start fresh somewhere else?" She shook her head firmly. That land is the only home my husband and I ever shared. Every inch of it holds a memory. Selling would be like losing him all over again. Kieran's expression softened. I understand holding on to memories. After my wife died, I couldn't stay in one place anymore. Everything reminded me of her. You were married, Constance asked, surprised. 5 years. Sarah died in childbirth along with our son 3 years ago. His voice was steady, but she could hear the grief beneath it. I've been drifting since then, taking work where I can find it. I'm sorry, she said softly. He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. It's time, he said, changing the subject as full darkness descended. They'll have posted a guard, but the others should be sleeping. We'll approach from downwind so the cattle don't smell us and spook. They moved silently through the trees, the only sound the gentle rustling of pine needles underfoot. The camp came into view. A small fire burned low, and 2 shapes were rolled in blankets beside it. The third man sat on a fallen log, rifle across his knees, facing the cattle that were settled in a natural depression. Kieran motioned for Constance to stay put, then circled around behind the guard. She watched, heart in her throat, as he crept closer. In one swift motion, Kieran brought the butt of his rifle down on the guard's head. The man crumpled without a sound. Before Constance could move, one of the sleeping men stirred, then sat up with a shout. Jake, what was that? Kieran swung around, but the second rustler was already on his feet, grabbing for his gun. Constance stepped from the trees, her revolver raised. Don't, she said clearly. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. The third rustler lunged for his rifle, but Kieran was faster, kicking it away and leveling his own weapon at the man's chest. That's enough, he said quietly. On your feet, both of you. They used leather strips from the rustler's own gear to bind their hands, then secured them to a tree well away from the camp. The cattle are too exhausted to move tonight, Kieran said. We'll rest here and head back at first light. They took turns keeping watch through the night. During her shift, Constance studied the sleeping form of Kieran O'Brien, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought this man to her ranch just when she needed help most. There was something about him that inspired trust, a directness in his gaze, a steadiness in his manner that reminded her of Benjamin, yet was entirely his own. When morning came, they found themselves with a new problem. These cattle are too tired and spooked to drive all the way back to your ranch today, Kieran said, assessing the herd, and we can't leave the rustlers tied up here indefinitely. What do you suggest? There's a ranger station about 5 miles north. We can leave the rustlers there and send word to the sheriff, then take the cattle back at a slower pace. Constance nodded, relieved to have someone sharing the burden of decisions for the first time in months. They delivered the rustlers to the startled but grateful forest ranger, who promised to keep them secure until the sheriff arrived from Independence. Then they began the slow process of driving the cattle home, a task that would normally require at least 4 experienced cowboys. The journey took 2 full days, during which Constance discovered Kieran was not only skilled with cattle but also a surprisingly good cook over an open fire, and possessed of a dry humor that occasionally broke through his reserved exterior. By the time the Rocking O came into view on the afternoon of the 3rd day, she felt as though she'd known him far longer than a few days. Hank rode out to meet them, his expression changing from concern to amazement as he spotted the cattle. Mrs. O'Hara. How in the world? His gaze shifted to Kieran. Mr. O'Brien helped me track them, Constance explained. The rustlers are in custody. Well, I'll be, Hank said, shaking his head. That's the best news I've heard in months. Together, the 3 of them herded the cattle into the home pasture. Constance felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she watched them drink from the stream and begin grazing peacefully. These 30 head represented hope, a fighting chance to keep the Rocking O alive a little longer. That evening, after Hank had gone home to his family, Constance invited Kieran to join her for supper in the main house. She prepared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd cooked for anyone besides herself. Thank you, she said as they sat at the kitchen table. I couldn't have recovered those cattle without you. Kieran accepted a bowl of stew. You'd have found a way. You strike me as a woman who doesn't give up easily. Perhaps, she smiled slightly, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. She hesitated, then added, my offer of room and board still stands if you're interested in staying on. I can't pay much yet, but with the cattle back, there's hope. He studied her for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. O'Hara? Constance, she corrected. And I'm proposing a partnership of sorts. Hank leaves at the week's end. I need someone who knows ranching to help me keep this place running until I can sell enough cattle to hire more hands. And what would I get out of this arrangement? His tone was curious, not challenging. A place to stay, steady meals, and a percentage of the profits once we're back on our feet. She met his gaze directly, and perhaps a chance to stay in one place for a while. Something flickered in his eyes' interest, or perhaps recognition of the olive branch she was extending. I've been drifting a long time, he admitted. Might be nice to set down roots again, even temporarily. Then you'll stay, he nodded once. I'll stay, but I have conditions of my own, which are, you let me teach you everything I know about running cattle. No husband or hired hand will always be around to do the hard work. If you're determined to keep this ranch, you need to know how to run every aspect of it yourself. Constance felt a mixture of indignation and grudging respect. I already know quite a bit, Mr. O'Brien. Kieran, he corrected with the first full smile she'd seen from him. And I'm sure you do, but there's always more to learn. She couldn't argue with that logic. Agreed. They shook hands across the table, and Constance tried to ignore the warm flutter in her stomach at the brief contact. It had been so long since she'd felt anything besides grief and worry that the sensation was almost foreign. As spring blossomed into summer, the Rocking O began a slow but steady recovery. Kieran proved to be as good as his word, working from dawn until dusk alongside Constance. He taught her to mend fence lines more efficiently, to recognize the subtle signs of illness in cattle before it spread through the herd, to predict weather patterns by the behavior of animals and the shape of clouds. For her part, Constance surprised him with her willingness to tackle any task, no matter how difficult or traditionally male. She never complained about the long hours or the physical toll, and her natural affinity with the animals made even the most stubborn steer eventually yield to her quiet authority. They settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings began with coffee shared in companionable silence as they planned the day's work. Evenings often found them on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple while discussing improvements to the ranch. By late June, they had repaired all the fences, nursed several sickly calves back to health, and cleared new grazing land. The first significant rainfall in months had transformed the pastures into lush carpets of green, and the cattle were thriving. Word spread through the county that the Rocking O was making a comeback. Sheriff Taylor rode out one afternoon, ostensibly to update them on the rustlers, now serving time in the territorial prison, but clearly curious about the ranch's revival and the man who had helped make it possible. You've done fine work here, Mrs. O'Hara, the sheriff said, his tone containing a note of surprise that made Constance bristle inwardly. And you, O'Brien, you planning to stay on? Kieran glanced at Constance before answering. For now, we make a good team. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly at the "we," but he merely nodded and took his leave. After he'd gone, Constance found Kieran in the barn, repairing a broken harness with methodical precision. People are talking, she said without preamble. His hands never paused in their work. People always talk, especially about a widow and a single man working a ranch together. Does it bother you? She asked, leaning against a post. He looked up then, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. Does it bother you? Constance considered the question. I stopped caring what people think the day I buried Benjamin. All that matters now is keeping this ranch alive. He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. Then we're agreed. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of the growing bond that went beyond mere business partnership. Constance found herself noticing small details about Kieran that had nothing to do with his skills as a rancher, the way sunlight brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. How his rare smiles transformed his entire face, the gentleness of his hands when tending to injured animals or helping her down from her horse. July brought scorching heat and the annual Independence Day celebration in town. Constance hadn't attended any social functions since Benjamin's death, but Kieran insisted they make an appearance. "The cattle are doing well," he said. "We might find buyers at the gathering. Besides, you can't hide out here forever." She knew he was right, though the prospect of facing the town's scrutiny made her stomach clench. The day of the celebration, she found herself standing before her mirror, smoothing the skirt of a blue dress she hadn't worn in over a year. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical braid, she left loose around her shoulders, the chestnut waves falling to the middle of her back. When she descended the stairs, Kieran was waiting by the door, dressed in clean denims and a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly trimmed. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "You look beautiful, Constance," he said simply. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." They rode into Independence together, arriving as the festivities were in full swing. American flags decorated the main street, and tables laden with food lined the town square. A band played lively music while couples danced on a wooden platform erected for the occasion. Constance felt the weight of curious stares as they tied their horses at the hitching post, but Kieran's steady presence beside her gave her courage. Emma had traveled from Cheyenne with her husband for the celebration, and her delighted cry cut through the crowd. "Mother, you came." She embraced Constance tightly, then pulled back to look at her with pleasant surprise. "You look wonderful." "It's good to see you, sweetheart," Constance said, drinking in the sight of her daughter, who seemed to have blossomed into an even more beautiful young woman in the months since her wedding. Emma's gaze shifted curiously to Kieran. Constance performed the introductions, watching as her daughter assessed the man who had become so important to their ranch and to her. "Mr. O'Brien has been a godsend," Constance explained. "The ranch is doing better than it has in months." "I'm relieved to hear it," Emma said sincerely. "And pleased to meet you, Mr. O'Brien. Anyone who helps my mother has my gratitude." "Your mother helps herself," Kieran replied. "I just lend a hand where needed." The afternoon passed pleasantly as they mingled with townsfolk, many of whom expressed surprise and approval at the Rocking O's recovery. Constance even secured a promising deal with a cattle buyer from Cheyenne, who agreed to visit the ranch the following week. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the square, the band struck up a waltz. Couples moved onto the dance floor, and Constance felt a pang of memory. Benjamin had loved to dance, often sweeping her into impromptu waltzes in their kitchen. "Would you care to dance?" She turned to find Kieran beside her, hand extended. Something in his eyes told her he understood exactly what he was asking, not just for a dance, but for her to take another step away from grief and toward whatever future awaited. Constance hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I would." He led her onto the dance floor with confident steps, one hand at the small of her back, the other clasping hers gently. They moved together with surprising ease, as if their bodies had already learned to anticipate each other's movements through months of shared work. "I didn't know you could dance," she said, looking up at him. "There's a lot you don't know about me yet," he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The word "yet" hung between them, full of possibility. As they turned around the floor, Constance became aware of nothing but the warmth of his hand against hers, the steady rhythm of their steps, and the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed between them. When the music ended, Kieran didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, he led her away from the crowd toward a quiet corner of the square where a massive oak provided shelter from curious eyes. "Constance," he began, his voice low and serious. "I need to say something, and I want you to listen before you respond." Her heart quickened. "All right. When I came to your ranch, I was just looking for work, a place to stay for a while before moving on, as I've done for 3 years. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But something happened that I didn't expect. I found reasons to stay, not just the ranch, but you." Constance felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Kieran, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're still grieving Benjamin. I know the ranch comes first. I respect that. I'm not asking for anything but honesty between us." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I care for you, Constance. More than I thought possible after Sarah. If friendship is all you can offer, I'll accept that gratefully, but I wanted you to know where I stand." The confession left her speechless. Part of her wanted to flee, to retreat behind the safety of widowhood and grief. Another part, a part that had been slowly awakening over the past months, wanted to step forward into whatever this man was offering. "I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. "I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for anyone. I know." His expression was understanding, not disappointed. "You don't need to say anything now. Just know that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Before she could respond, Emma appeared, breathless and smiling. "There you are, Mother, Mr. O'Brien. You simply must try Mrs. Patterson's apple pie before it's all gone." The moment passed, but Constance carried Kieran's words with her throughout the remainder of the evening. When they rode home under a canopy of stars, the silence between them was charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions. At the ranch house door, they paused. Custom dictated that Kieran should bid her goodnight and return to the bunkhouse, as he had every night for months. But tonight felt different. "Thank you for the dance," she said, her voice softer than intended. "Thank you for the company." He hesitated, then gently touched her cheek with one calloused hand. "Good night, Constance." She watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit pastures, and felt something bloom in her chest that had been dormant for too long. Hope, not just for the ranch, but for herself. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity to the Rocking O. The cattle buyer from Cheyenne purchased 20 head at a fair price, providing enough capital to hire 2 young cowboys and make essential repairs to the barn roof before autumn arrived. Kieran trained the new hands with patient thoroughness, while Constance managed the finances with growing confidence. Despite their busy days, Constance found herself seeking out Kieran's company in the quiet evenings. Sometimes they discussed ranch business, but more often they shared stories of their past, her childhood in Kentucky, his years traveling with his father across the frontier, the dreams they'd each had before loss had reshaped their lives. One evening in late August, they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of crimson and gold. A comfortable silence had fallen between them when Kieran spoke. "I've been thinking about planting an orchard on that south slope near the creek," he said. "Apple and pear trees would do well there. In a few years, they'd provide extra income and some protection against bad cattle years." Constance turned to look at him, struck by the implication of his words. "A few years," he met her gaze steadily. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." "Orchards take planning," she said carefully, "and patience, and commitment to a place." "Yes, they do." His eyes never left hers. "All things I'm prepared to offer if they're welcome." The air between them seemed to still. In that moment, Constance recognized the choice before her to remain safely within the boundaries of the past, or to step forward into an uncertain but potentially wonderful future. "They're welcome," she said softly. "Very welcome." Something in his expression shifted, a tension releasing. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. When his lips met hers, the kiss was gentle, questioning. Constance answered by sliding her hand to the back of his neck and drawing him closer. When they finally broke apart, she was trembling slightly, overwhelmed by emotions long suppressed. Kieran took her hands in his touch an anchor in the storm of her feelings. "I'm not trying to replace Benjamin," he said. "I know what he meant to you. I know." She squeezed his hands. "Just as I know I could never replace Sarah. We both carry our pasts with us. But perhaps we can build a future together if you're willing." His smile was answer enough. Autumn brought cooler temperatures and the cattle roundup, which proceeded smoothly with the help of the new hands. By the time the first snow dusted the peaks of the distant mountains, the Rocking O was better prepared for winter than it had been in years. The barn was full of hay, the root cellar stocked with vegetables from Constance's expanded garden, and the herd healthy and growing. Kieran moved from the bunkhouse to the main house as the weather turned cold, taking up residence in the spare bedroom. Though their relationship had deepened, they maintained a propriety that respected both their positions in the community and the memories of their previous marriages. Emma visited at Thanksgiving, bringing her husband and the news that they were expecting their first child in the spring. She took Constance aside during her stay, her expression serious. "Are you happy, Mother? Truly happy?" Constance glanced through the window to where Kieran was chopping wood, his breath visible in the cold air. "Yes," she said simply, "I am. Then I'm happy for you." Emma hugged her tightly. "Father would want this for you, you know. He'd never have wanted you to be alone." The words lifted a weight Constance hadn't realized she still carried permission, not that she needed it, but that she welcomed nonetheless. Christmas arrived with a heavy snowfall that transformed the ranch into a glistening white landscape. On Christmas Eve, after a simple but joyful dinner, Kieran presented Constance with a small wooden box. "I'm not much for fancy gifts," he said as she opened it, "but this seemed right." Inside lay a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a wild rose, its petals intricately detailed. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing of hers I kept after she passed. She always said wild roses were survivors beautiful despite the harsh conditions they grow in." He took her hand. "Like you?" Constance blinked back tears. "Thank you." "I'll treasure it." She hesitated, then reached beneath the tree for her own gift to him. "This isn't nearly as meaningful, I'm afraid." Kieran unwrapped the package to find a fine leather-bound journal and a silver pen. "For planning that orchard," she explained. "And whatever else you dream up for our future." His eyes lit at the word "our," and he pulled her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than words. As winter deepened, the ranch settled into a peaceful rhythm. The newly hired hands proved reliable, allowing Constance and Kieran more time to plan for spring planting and the expansion of the herd. In the evenings, they would often sit before the fire, Constance working on mending while Kieran sketched layouts for the orchard in his new journal. One night in late January, a particularly fierce blizzard howled around the house, rattling windows and driving snow into drifts that reached the porch railings. They had just finished checking on the cattle in the barn, ensuring all were sheltered from the storm when Kieran turned to Constance in the warm kitchen. "Marry me," he said without preamble, his eyes serious in the lamplight. Constance stared at him, the mug of coffee in her hands momentarily forgotten. "What, marry me?" he repeated. "I love you, Constance. I think I have since that first day when you stood your ground and refused to give up on this place." He took the mug from her and set it aside, taking both her hands in his. "I know it hasn't been that long, and if you need more time, I understand, but I don't need more time to know what I want." She studied his face, the strong lines now familiar and dear to her, the blue eyes that could read both cattle trails and her moods with equal accuracy, the mouth that had learned to smile more freely in recent months. "Yes," she said, surprised at how easily the word came. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was brilliant as he gathered her into his arms. "I promise you won't regret it," he murmured against her hair. "I know I won't," she replied, certain in a way she hadn't been about anything since Benjamin's death. They were married in the Independence Church on a bright April morning with Emma, now visibly expecting, standing as witness alongside her husband. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by neighbors who had come to respect the partnership that had saved the Rocking-O. Afterward, they celebrated at the ranch with a feast prepared by the women of the community, who had gradually accepted Constance back into their fold as the ranch prospered. Even Sheriff Taylor offered sincere congratulations, admitting that he'd been wrong about the Rocking-O's chances. That evening, as twilight settled over the land, Constance and Kieran stood together on the porch of what was now truly their home. In the pastures below, cattle grazed peacefully, and the first seedlings of their apple orchard had been planted that morning, a wedding gift to themselves and to the future. "Are you happy?" Kieran asked, his arm around her waist. Constance leaned into his embrace, thinking of how far she had come from that desperate widow facing ruin. Completely, she answered truthfully. Are you? More than I ever thought possible again. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thank you for giving me a home, Constance. Not just this ranch, but here. He placed her hand over his heart. And thank you, she replied softly, for teaching me to hope again when I thought all hope was lost. As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, watching stars appear in the vast Wyoming sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds, bound by love and a shared vision for the land that had brought them together. In the years that followed, the Rocking O thrived under their combined care. The apple orchard blossomed and began bearing fruit, becoming known throughout the county for its quality. The cattle herd grew steadily, allowing them to hire more hands and expand their operations. Emma gave birth to a son, then a daughter 2 years later, both of whom loved visiting their grandparents' ranch and learning to ride almost before they could walk. In the spring of 1885, Constance gave birth to a son they named James Benjamin O'Brien, a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Sarah Elizabeth, named for both their pasts but very much a child of their shared future. The ranch house expanded along with their family, new rooms added to accommodate growing children and occasional visitors. The bunkhouse that had once been Kieran's solitary dwelling became home to a rotating crew of cowboys who respected the unusual partnership at the heart of the Rocking O, a woman who had refused to surrender her dreams, and a man who had found his purpose in helping those dreams flourish. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were finally asleep, Constance and Kieran would often return to the porch where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. There, watching the sun set over land that had seen both their despair and their joy, they would share the comfortable silence of two people who had discovered that sometimes, when life seems darkest, hope arrives in the most unexpected forms. And in the wild roses that eventually grew alongside their orchard, Constance saw the truth of Kieran's words from that long-ago Christmas, that beauty could emerge from the harshest conditions, and that with patience, care, and love, even the most damaged hearts could bloom again. By their 10th wedding anniversary, the Rocking O had become one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. Their children grew strong and capable, learning the business from both parents, who continued to work side by side despite the ranch's success, allowing them to hire ample help. The apple orchard had expanded to include cherries and plums, providing a steady income that helped weather the inevitable lean years in the cattle business. Through it all, Constance never forgot those desperate months after Benjamin's death, when she had stood on the brink of losing everything. She kept his memory alive for their daughter Emma and her children, just as Kieran spoke of Sarah to their own son and daughter. The past was not denied but honored, woven into the fabric of their present happiness rather than overshadowing it. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Constance still whispered thanks to the twist of fate that had brought a weary cowboy to her door on a stormy spring evening, Kieran never minded. For he too gave thanks for second chances, for the healing power of love, and for a woman strong enough to rebuild her life and brave enough to let him be part of it. Together, they had transformed a failing ranch into a legacy that would endure long after them, a testament to the truth that hope, once rekindled, could light the way forward even through the darkest of times.